So let's talk about BIM scoping. We began with BIM planning, and a component of planning is having a good scope. So they are tied together somewhat, but the scope, as we defined in the Q&A in the first part, is actually one of the biggest misunderstandings. And not having a clear scope then results in a huge number of miscommunication, a huge amount of miscommunication and error and confusion, waste and time and money. So we're going to open with the current situation. I'll talk a bit about the history of LOD, and then the challenges. We have 6 challenges here as well. And then we'll talk about the solutions to those 6 challenges that we have been able to see and implement. So to start with, to understand and identify with you, as you shared with us, it's difficult. It's not a simple process, and 92%, this is a report back in 2016, that from BIM specification perspective, 92% said, yeah, I've got some challenges with that. I have difficulties. And the result, or the impact, the cause and then the effect here is owners are saying that the design management process is the biggest challenge that they have. Engineers are saying that they end up spending twice the hours. So we were talking about architects spending more time learning and spending more money in order to be able to do this. More than twice the hour, end up spending twice the hours estimating on BIM projects. Architects signing up for scope that they know they can't deliver just to win a project. And I thought, so when I spent 6 months traveling around the world validating whether what we were doing was actually going to be useful for anybody. And I was so surprised that this one in the top right-hand corner came up almost every time I met an architect. It was, I want to embrace this BIM thing, and when an owner asks for BIM, I say yes. And when an owner said to an architect in California, I would like LOD 400 on our project plus Kobe, they said yes. And not knowing that that was going to get them in serious trouble later on down the line, an architect delivering fabrication level everything is a ridiculous thing. It's a ridiculous thing to ask in the first place. But the owner didn't know, and it's a very simple thing to put into a contract, and a very, very difficult thing for the situation later on down the line. And then we have contractors, and this was an example where the contractor had signed up for, in this exact, it was a different team, but it was a different project, but LOD 400 as the deliverable. And they thought that they were smart by just taking that and putting it to the trades, to their contracts. So I've offset my risk, everything's fantastic. But what happened there is they got to the end of the project and they thought they were done, but the owner said, where's the LOD 400 model? You know, this is something that we contracted you for. Oh, we need to ask the trades. And the trade said, I have no idea. I don't even do BIM. Don't know what you're talking about. And so imagine that situation where they literally can't close the project out until they make this deliverable. So they ended up having to have that outsourced and create the model as a deliverable themselves, because there was no way they were going to get anything from the trades. Each and every one of it was a ridiculous situation. So if we don't have a good scoping process, we end up in this ripple effect. And we asked, this is an interesting one. So this was a poll. We have webinars every month. And one of the polls was, how do your owners request BIM? The answers are on the top right. Do they say BIM please? Is there no discussion whatsoever about BIM? Do they ask for LOD 500 plus Kobe, like something, just LOD 300 plus? Or do they have very clear BIM goals? So we have the percentages, and I will reveal one at a time. But which one do you think was the highest? Was it, so here 47, nearly 50%, half of people said that it was one of the ones on the right-hand side? Any votes?
No discussion.
No discussion?
LOD 500.
Okay, so we've got... Okay, you don't think that it's clear BIM goals?
No.
No, clear goals, 1.8%, obviously, yeah? But that's really sad. That's really unfortunate. What do we do about it? How can we improve this? How can we have a situation where there are more than half of owners are saying, yes, we do need some BIM, but only 1.8% of those are actually asking for something that can be delivered. It's a big, big gap. So the second poll, just to have some involvement from you guys, what do you think we talked about before, we saw the concept of LOD and seeing that it's a fixed number, 100 through 500, or including 350, or not including 100, or not including 500, or not including, depends on who you talk to, which standards you use. But what do you think is the most common misunderstanding when defining, let's call it scope, and scope for BIM definition? The information? The amount of information, so we've got a vote here. Anybody else? Which one would be your top? Lots to choose from. So is it the scope? So from an element, we don't know which elements we should include, which ones we shouldn't. Is it about the geometry and the detail required? Is it the information? Is it the accuracy? Is it how mature or how reliable that information or the elements should be? Is it the BIM use? So knowing why the information, why the elements. The last one, yeah? Not knowing why. Okay, yeah, it's a mix of these, I'm sure. So not knowing what information is important and not knowing really why you're doing something, they can be pretty challenging. It's difficult to do anything if you don't know why you're doing it. It's the way that we are created as humans as well. It would be so much easier to understand and to do something if we understand why we're doing it in the first place. And then the third poll, so we've talked about LOD very, very broadly, but what is LOD? We had a few people raise their hand that they were aware of it at the beginning. Anybody care to share with us what they think that the concept is, or can do, or should do? LOD, anybody?
Very shy.
Absolutely, very shy, but it's really difficult as well, because unfortunately it's defined in many different ways around the world. And so Marcia, actually, I will meet Marcia in London tomorrow, just a bit of a coincidence there. But since we started it back in the VICO days, it has been adapted and adopted and changed and morphed and updated and added to and removed and put under a different umbrella and renamed so many different times in different countries. What it does show is that there is an absolute need for something to manage the definition of scope. That is 100% certain because of the amount of adoption of this concept since we first started it. What it also shows is that there is complete confusion.
Yeah.
Yeah? It wasn't me that time. Was that? Okay. It was going to sleep. Hopefully it wasn't me. So the history for level of detail started off as being called detail when we started it in VICO days. That was because we were really interested in the geometric detail because we were calculating quantities directly from that 3D geometry. So we needed to understand if the column was going to be a round column because we wanted the surface area. We needed to be sure that that was going to be a round column rather than just placed as a square column or we needed to know the way that the windows were modeled because we wanted to get square area of each pane or count the number of panes rather than expect it to be one piece. We needed to understand how the every single detail, if we were going to take quantities off. If we were not going to quantify, then we didn't need it. And so this was the important word for us at that time. But as it became a standard and more adopted by the AIA, and from an architecture perspective, it was about protecting themselves from somebody incorrectly using the model. So development, how developed is this? Is it developed enough for you to take quantities from? I am the one to say that. Even if it might be really, really detailed, I'm still not going to say that it is developed enough for you to be able to take quantities from. And that is a reliability aspect. So we've got, from a geometry perspective, from a reliability perspective, and then we start to add definition. So in the UK, somewhere here, it was added as a concept of overall, we understand we need to have detail, but under the umbrella of definition, we're also going to include this concept of information, because information became more important with the requirements from a handover to the owner, because that information about warranty and manufacturer and replacement cost and who installed it became really, really important. So detail, development, definition, information, all are very, very interesting concepts. There then became level of LOG and LOC and LOA, and you can have this long, long list of different scales and definitions. It's really confusing. Really confusing. So come back to this image. On the left is a good BIM, on the right is a good BIM, but it depends which BIM we need. And if we don't have a way of describing it by saying, yes, we do want each and every ceiling tile modeled with the hangers and each of the changes in elevation of the ceiling, or no, we only want a square area of the ceiling, we're not interested in any steps up and down. If we don't define what we are modeling and what we aren't modeling, or what detail we need, then it's going to be very challenging for the teams to actually evaluate and create. So I talked a bit about why this is difficult. We identified 6 key areas, key reasons why this is a challenge for us, and why starting as an original idea of, yes, we need to do something, became a huge myriad of different options of how we might do it around the world. So this is actually enforced by some of the quotes that we had from people around the world. This one, and I'm sure that the people, so this is being recorded, you guys know who you are, but I definitely won't share who you are because some of these are pretty damning. We find most BIM standards overly complex and difficult for our teams to implement. So, same sort of principles we had before. There are too many different options. Things change. I mean, so not identifying one or the other. So in the US, lots of differences as we adopt. Whether we change what the definition is, or for example, if you follow the AIA recognizes LOD 100, 200, 300, 400, and 500. However, the BIM Forum has an interpretation of that is more widely used, not recognizing 100, but 200, 300, 350, and 400, not 500, because 500 is an as-built scale, which is not part of that standard. So there's different ways of interpreting and different parts of the scales and different things that change. The second one, prompted by this statement, some areas there's too much detail, some content is non-existent, standards to, I think I've done this the reverse, but okay. Either way, we can't practically use most standards on real projects. So sometimes we end up with a standard that's not tried and tested, and we end up, because it's new for our industry, in a situation where we are modifying them for projects and then reluctant to use it on the next one. So we really want standards that can continually improve and are really live feedback from real projects to be able to improve them, and that's a really key, important part. Incredible amount of complexity. We've seen this slide before. There's lots of different really good standards, really good guidelines, but lots of different ones and can be very complex. Standards seem to be too fixed. We talked about this one, and understanding, so we have found it a real challenge to implement without the flexibility for us to fill in the gaps. So when we saw this slide before in the planning aspect, we talked about one number trying to tie all of these things together and it being extremely difficult. It's more of a scoping perspective than a planning perspective, as we said. And then specifically LOD 500, where LOD 500 was specified because the owner wanted information added to the elements for FM. We wasted time modeling way too many elements that were not important for the owner. And so this concept of a scale that progresses from 1 to 2 to 3, it is a building scale. The expectation is that it's getting more detailed and more accurate and more information and more of everything. But when we break down LOD 500, you have the concept of geometry and the belief, so you go more and more and more potentially in geometry, and then when you hand over a model, do you need more geometry for as-built than you do to fabricate something? No. Does an owner maybe sometimes want less geometry? So it's either the same or less, potentially. And then accuracy, the same thing. You don't want more accuracy. Usually it's the same or less, but information could be higher. So actually, when we see LOD 500, there's another. It could be that we want a lot less geometry, a lot less elements, or a lot less essentially geometric detail. We are not so interested in the accuracy, and we could have a huge amount of information, but it might be that only a small amount of information is actually important to the owner. When we were implementing our standards at a previous owner, we had 17 parameters that were important to us. Even though we could have asked for hundreds of different parameters, as an owner with a staff of 850 people maintaining buildings, we could only come up with or require those that were important to us. So a much slimmer set of parameters, and therefore, from a lean perspective, reducing the amount of work for handover, but still calling it LOD 500. This one, to win the project, we agreed with the owner that we would provide LOD 400 plus COVID data. And so therefore, we see a big challenge is education. Educating teams, educating owners, educating those specifying, asking. Unfortunately, what happens in this situation is that there's an agreement made, not really sure what's going to happen, but because we've got this BIM manager that's got all of the VR goggles and got a huge laptop, can run the model and open it, I'm sure that we've got it okay, everything's done, everything's agreed, and we can deliver. But there's the design team potentially disconnected and causing this confusion. So the BIM manager, is that the one person that we should rely on to change our industry and educate everybody and continually improve our project? It's a big ask, especially because a lot of those people are more technology savvy and less construction or design savvy, and we are asking somebody a few years out of school to come in and implement change management inside an organization, which is another level entirely. Another situation here, the quote, "We like using the images with standards, but you need 2 monitors, one screen to see the spec and another to see the Excel sheet." So I was trying to remember which country this was, but they were using the US standard, and they were talking about having to have 2 monitors to be able to see what the images in the spec look like and then plug in numbers to their Excel sheet. And they were always disconnected, and they would always have these discussions about what LOD 300 really meant for this scope. And quite comically, I also sit on some of these sessions with the BIM Forum. Looking forward to that actually next week in Vegas. And there are discussions within our group, and there is a huge amount of confusion even within the expert community as to exactly what certain things are. And going back and looking at the spec, what's written here, to try and understand. So this disconnection between the scope and the spec is also causing more misunderstanding and more blame as a result, and as we saw before, owners that are not getting what they are looking for. So those 6 challenges: too many standards, very complex, one scale or one number, specifically LOD 500 being a miss, thinking that it's going to be more of everything, but actually it's usually less. Educating teams, and then connecting the way that we have standards and the way that we run projects together. And so what we said was, what if? What if we could cross-map an open BIM framework for these standards? So if whichever standard you chose, you could use the same environment, and it would be set up to switch from one to the other. It doesn't matter which projects you're working on. What about if it was actually simple? Rather than having a complex set of different systems and guides and etc., what if we could put all of those into one simple and accessible and very collaborative workflow? What if instead of having one fixed number to define everything, what if we made that flexible so that you could turn on and off and adjust those from the standard? When you made adjustments, it just became a special condition. And what if that LOD 500, when you hit that point, it turned into an as-built scale with an accuracy, level of accuracy that you could choose for that definition? And what if we, instead of using even a numbering system, we converted that into plain language? So instead of having something that might say, this is LOD 300, and then somebody says, what's LOD 300? Let's go and check the spec. And, okay, basically it's detailed elements that have been proposed but haven't been coordinated yet. Well, why don't we write that so that people can read that and not have to interpret a numbering scale? That makes sense. And what if we help by providing this in a way that can be shared, so that if somebody has a great standard, they can share it with the rest of the world? And why not provide all of this free to education so universities around the world can teach a simplified method to plan using plain language? And then the 6th one, what if we connected the spreadsheet with the images so that you could understand at the construction stage whether you are or not going to model certain elements, and when you click on these you can turn them on and off, and you can visually define your scope rather than in a written form only. So being able to do both of these at the same time, integrating the scope and the spec together, becomes your project plan. So we looked at having an open BIM framework, making it simple, making it flexible, being able to define what you would like to in a plain language, and making sure that we benefit from the visual nature of what BIM is and what it can be. And this is just an example screenshot. So we talked about, first of all, BIM planning and how important it is to have an execution plan, what the challenges were and how we've looked at making that part easier. And then we've just discussed scoping and the current situation, the history of how we have started or tried to use a numbering scale, how that has been developed around the world in different ways, and the challenges that have resulted from quite a lot of miscommunication, and then some of those solutions that we have put in place to make that workflow easier.